thank you so much for joining the AmeriCorps Connections podcast. If you haven't done it already, please hit subscribe. It really makes a difference in the podcast algorithms. So if you like this content and you want it to continue, I just need you to hit subscribe and share it.
One time somebody came into the office, it was usually remote because of the pandemic, but one person wanted to meet in person and she was in tears because she was like, if I don't get this grant from the state, she was like, I'm like done for.
Callie, I'm excited to be here. And a little bit of background funness is that me and your mom are coworkers. And when I found out that you were an AmeriCorps alum, I got to get her on the podcast. I'm excited to be highlighting and showcasing your AmeriCorps year in this interview. Let's start with, how did you find out about AmeriCorps and what made you want to join?
Yeah. I had moved back home after trying out a grad school program that just wasn't quite what I wanted. And I had done a previous service year in Maryland, where I grew up, where I'm from originally. And it was not affiliated with AmeriCorps, but it was focused on Chesapeake Bay conservation. Very similar model of a service year, looking to attract younger people who are interested in career exploration and learning skills and that sort of thing. And I enjoyed that program. I enjoyed being part of that cohort. It was similar, where you got placed at a host site. They were all in the state of Maryland, and they were all environmental organizations focused on either directly or indirectly Chesapeake Bay conservation. So more of a specific focus than the general AmeriCorps program. But it was, again, very similar model, and just enjoyed being part of that cohort and learning. And then the COVID pandemic happened in the middle of that service year. So I finished up that service year during that. And then just with kind of the uncertainty with the economy at that time, and just thinking about wanting to help in some way, just getting a feeling that I was doing something helpful, even if it wasn't direct COVID relief or anything like that. I started thinking about AmeriCorps, having done this previous service year. And so I actually just went onto the good old My AmeriCorps portal page, which at the time, I don't know if they've done any updates on it since, that was very almost kind of quaint and very felt very old school interface and the portal and everything. But I was just searching opportunities first in Maryland, and then I focused my search on Vermont, because that is somewhere that my grandparents lived there at the time. And also I had visited them a number of times as a child, pretty much every summer in Vermont, and was familiar with the southern part of the state, and thought that it might be an interesting opportunity to serve somewhere that I was familiar with but hadn't lived before, and stumbled across the opportunity where I ended up being a VISTA and serving at that host site, and that was the Bennington County Regional Commission.
I love that. So good on you for being like, okay, I did this conservation corps, I'm interested in AmeriCorps, and you knew where to focus. And how cool was it to go to a place where your grandparents were and that you visited? Obviously, you ended up getting that service year. And what did you like? What was the onboarding, and what were some of the projects that you were focusing on?
Yeah, so once I actually got there and started the service year, which was September of 2021, I met with my supervisor and we had this conversation, and he was like, yeah, we're going to have to shift a number of things because we've had to do some pivoting in our office in light of the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the position was primarily focused on economic development. You know, VISTA is a program focused on capacity building and poverty alleviation. That was a pretty consistent focus of my host site. That didn't really change. It was more like the specifics of what I would be working on. I think I ended up helping with a number of implementing and coordinating some of the Vermont statewide pandemic recovery programs for people who had faced economic hardships brought about by the pandemic. And so our office was helping administer some of those programs locally in the Bennington County area. And so that was one focus of my service. And then the other focus was through a partnership with the local college here in Bennington. I was working on a food security initiative that they had funding for. So it was really these two interesting, slightly separate pieces of the economic development side of things, where I was working directly under my supervisor at the Bennington County Regional Commission. BCRC is just easier to say. So that's what I'll say from now on. And then working with this faculty member at Bennington College, which is a 4-year liberal arts, very small liberal arts college here in Bennington, on a food security grant that they had.
I think that's a really great description of how flexible a service year can be and how in the moment we can be responsive to what's actually happening to our community. And while nobody could have even guessed what the pandemic was going to bring to everybody, how great it was that in your service, you were able to traverse these two different areas that were so specifically in need of support. And everybody was just trying to figure out what systems that we needed to engage in to keep our business running, keep our employees paid, and keep service. How during your service year, so tell me again, what year did you start? Was it literally 2020?
Yeah, I think I misspoke earlier. I said September 2021, but it was actually September 2020.
Well,
So it's actually 2020, and it was hadn't even gone through a full year of impacts of COVID yet. So it was
yeah,
September 2020 through September of 2021, which is when
I was gonna
completed
say,
the
and
service.
we were kind of like fits and starts, like we're good. Oh wait, no, we're not.
Yeah.
We're good. Oh yeah. So tell us any of the interactions that you had with the folks between that time period where you were focusing on helping folks get connected to resources. Like, what were some of the things where you were, this is really changing my outlook on how systems are built in the United States?
Yeah, they were kind of like, again, there were those two sides of the economic development and then the food security. So at the economic development, there was this program that Vermont created in response to the pandemic called the Restart Vermont Technical Assistance Program, or REVTA. And it was meant to help small businesses with a priority of BIPOC owned, women owned, veteran owned businesses, and I think maybe some other priority populations as well, to help them recover and or pivot from the pandemic. And so it was meant to be like a business could apply and get paired with a technical assistance provider. And that could look like they were a small business who didn't have any kind of e-commerce presence, but they needed one now because of the pandemic to, build some sort of, website to advertise their products. And so they could get paired with a, web development company that had been certified through the REVTA program to help get them built, a website. Or even I think they could get paired with like an architect who could help, redesign some of their spaces to adhere to social distancing requirements, which were in place at the time. And so just, some things like that. And it was really interesting talking with some of the local business owners. A lot of them were like sole proprietors. So they're just one person show doing everything, and maybe hadn't dealt with like a web presence before, hadn't had to branch out into these other areas. And then COVID really threw them for a loop. And then I also realized how this obviously isn't the case for all small business owners, but a lot of them there's a lot of financial precarity involved in being a small business owner. And that potential loss or the actual loss of revenue was really, I think, scary for a lot of them. And just having to pivot to either web systems, or like some of them like experimenting with shipping their products to customers, which is something they hadn't done before. And so we were trying to make that match with the technical assistance providers. And then there were some other programs too through the state where we were maybe helping businesses fill out applications to get like COVID relief funds that the state had. And yeah, it was just really interesting. There were some times where a business owner would come into one time somebody came into the office. It was usually remote because of the pandemic, but one person wanted to meet in person, and she was in tears because she was like, if I don't get this grant from the state, she was like, I'm like done for. So it was very emotional.
I always love this about a service year. And I thought my service year was going to be this, and then it turned out to be this. And we go with the flow as national service members. And well, I'm helping these folks do these sorts of things. Could you kind of sum that up? What was your ethos? What I feel like our ethos of our service year develops during our service year.
And I'm trying to do the best that I could to answer their questions as best as I could and about a certain application or that sort of thing. Also something in terms of leaving like a lesson learned, something that came up a lot with the food security side of my Vista year was like, I now know like it's not a good idea to start something that's going to be like have like ownership after the Vista has left, or if there isn't a plan for the next Vista, if there's going to be one to pick it up, or for an organization to ultimately take responsibility for it. One of the projects I was working on through the food security grant was a food system asset map for Bennington County, basically mapping all of the different components of the food system in Bennington County, from all the growers, so farmers, to the value added producers like people who make yogurt and cheese and that sort of thing, to the distribution, like the retail food, like grocery stores and corner markets, to disposal, like places where you compost or take trash, that sort of thing. And it was a really interesting project that I was working on with folks from Bennington College. That was a visual map showing these different components that you could go to one or the other. But interesting snapshot from a time from a few years ago, especially like if an organization has a plan in place for Vista succession, and or if the organization it has a plan to like, okay, once the Vista has set up this system or set up the project, whatever it is, we take ownership of it as the organization and we just build upon it, keep it updated, put that into it. But if that piece isn't there, then I think that can lessen the impact of things that service members do.
That's such a good jumping off point of the lessons learned during our service year that we carry with us afterwards, where you're talking about what's the succession plan of this. I can do all the asset mapping and research and pour all of this information into this is where all the organization is. But
yeah,
as your mom and I often say, data is only as good as it is you input and export it. So during my service year that I always like to use because it's a good visual. No memory gardens in parks unless you have a 2-year contract. Let's not create or do something that is a 3-month-long thing that never leads to anything that's sustainable. I think that what you're speaking to is during your service year. Do you carry that now? Let's shift into this podcast is about AmeriCorps alums service year, but I'm really interested in what people are doing now and how that thread pulls through into what you're up to now. So were there any great moments where you're like, I don't know, is this sustainable, or any lessons learned that you pulled through from your service year to what you're doing now? And tell folks what you're doing now, and then we'll pull on that.
Yeah, so what I'm doing now, actually, I was hired by my host site after my service year ended. And once I was hired, my focus shifted a little bit. So BCRC it's an interesting entity, and I'm going to try and simplify it as much as I can because there's a lot of like technical stuff. Vermont doesn't have county government the way a lot of other states do. You have municipal government, like city and towns, mostly towns because it's very small and rural here. And then you have the state government, which encompasses a variety of agencies. And then other than there's a county court system, but other than that, there's no county government the way that Maryland, where I'm from, has a very strong county government system. And so regional planning commissions like BCRC are there to fill the gap in terms that, like, we're not official county government, but we are technically a public entity, and we help municipalities with the go-between between state and municipalities. But then we have this other realm to our organization, which is unique in that we also do economic development work. And so that is what I was doing when I was the Vista. But then when I got hired, I shifted over to the regional planning technical assistance for municipalities side of things. So it was interesting that I got hired, but didn't get hired like into a position that was natural extension of my Vista year. I just got hired into a position where I still had to there was still a learning curve, even though I'd technically been there for a year because it was a whole new position.
I also think that that's also a great example of the potential. Like, I felt like during my service year, I was showing folks what I could do, but I can expand. And to your point about doing Vista, and I was state and national, so I had a little bit more flexibility with
Mm,
direct service. But you're dipping your toes and going like, yeah, but I'm the one that figures it out. I'm the one that gets things done. And
yeah.
that leads you to the organization that you're working for, your service site, to be like, that's the potential. So when you move into a position and it's not totally well defined, but
Yeah.
it's defined by Callie's experience and skills and what she's reflected back on what she can do for this organization, which I think is so exciting. That's one of the things I get so excited about during his
Yeah.
service year. So yeah, continue. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, I think, what I learned and what we talked about in terms of succession planning and don't create a program or a project that the organization doesn't have the capacity or the intentions of maintaining. And I've kind of seen that because since that in my role, we worked with interns from various universities and whatnot, or students working on a project as part of a class. And when I've been involved in working with interns or students on projects at our office, generally, I think I want to think of, okay, what are some things that we actually need help? We're not just going to come up with a project for them to do that we think would be really cool, but then we're not going to do anything with that once they have
Right.
finished. And so now I'm very much of the mind that we should be thinking about what we actually need. What are the things that we are already going to be working on that we just need some support
Mhm.
on? And that is what an intern or a student can help us with. And oftentimes too, they can feel gratified knowing that they're helping with a project that we are already doing and not just something that we came up with to have them do
Right.
that doesn't really have a clear connection or impact. And in organizations supporting the college on its things it was already doing, because one part of that grant was the college was managing it, but they were partnering with all these different organizations in the county on food security. Again, that's how it goes sometimes. You have this great idea and something could be great, and then it doesn't always click into place. But I tried to think about that whenever I am working with interns or students or short-term people, that we are thinking about what we're going to do with their deliverable, their
Yeah.
product.
Maybe I should do a special series of all of the AmeriCorps alums who served during the pandemic, because what was important prior to, like you said, this outline of this Vista service might not be relevant to what's happening now. But I love that you take that experience from your Vista year to think through, how are we going to use these
Yeah.
fellows? I want to circle back to what you're doing now, and like, what do you get the best gratification out from what you're doing at this point in Vermont? It's cold.
Yeah. It was pretty moderate today, actually. It was rainy,
Yeah.
but it was like 60s. Not too bad. One of the things that's been gratifying to be able to stay on in the community and do is to actually meet people and make connections and see how things evolve and change over time. It was interesting when I started my service year. Again, it was during the pandemic, and a lot of it had to be remote, like per state health and safety requirements. So I went into the office a couple times when I first started, but really then after it, and then definitely from like the fall into the winter when there were infection spikes again, and we were
Right.
still pre-vaccine, is I actually didn't have a choice. I had to be working remotely. And so I did a lot of this work, but I didn't really get to connect with people
Yeah.
very much, other than obviously Zoom calls like we're doing now. But then when I got the job offer and got to stay, and then things improved to the point that it was safe to go back into the office and take up in-person activities again. It was really gratifying to have formed those relationships with my coworkers that I hadn't been able to fully cultivate in a remote environment, but then also continue relationships or form new ones with people in the community. Sometimes with a Vista year, if you move somewhere and you do your year and you leave, you don't get to see how the community evolves after you finish your service year and left. So it's been cool to see that, and cool to see while the food security grant ended and some of the projects like the asset map, unfortunately, just through nobody's fault, fizzled out. Momentum in other areas continued, and I was actually involved and on the board for a while of starting a nonprofit grocery store in downtown Bennington, which is, well, maybe was, because there's a grocery store now, a food desert area. So, and that community market is still going. I recently stepped off the board, but I think a lot of the momentum for that came out of the partners who coalesced around that food security grant.
Yeah.
I've seen that market. I joined the board before it had opened. I saw it open. It's been open for a handful of years now. I've seen some of the projects that the community market has been able to do, like cultural lunch series. They did a employment and skills training classes for refugees who arrived in the community. They've got a baby cafe that's support for new parents and breastfeeding support and all that kind of. So I've seen that grow, and I wouldn't have gotten to see that if I had left at the end of my service year. So that's really nice. I really enjoy that.
That's amazing. And that's cool that you get to extend on. So this podcast hits folks that are alums. And then I've actually gotten comments and emails that are like, I didn't know about AmeriCorps, but I think this is perfect for my nephew. And they send them interviews with NCCC members or whatever. So as we start to land this plane, what are a few things that you would love for the alums to reflect on? What do you want this group of 1.3 million of us to actually do? And is there a call to action that, I don't know, maybe people in Vermont are listening to this that you want them to get engaged with or involved with?
Well, there's a number of things. First, everybody should, I'll say this and then I'll add some caveats, but I think everybody should do a service year. I've heard people say everyone should work in retail or food service or customer service. Definitely heard people say that, but everybody should do a service year. And the caveats I'll add is that I think it oftentimes takes a fair amount of financial privilege to be able to do that. Because I know it differs. The stipend that AmeriCorps members receive differ depending on what program you're in and what area of the country you're serving in. But oftentimes it's like poverty level wages, or at least it was in my program. And a lot of people simply can't afford that. They can't afford to take that low pay and get paid in experience and hope that it's going to turn into something after that. They need a job that is going to or pay them better or give them better benefits. I'll add that in a perfect world, everybody should do a service year, I think, because it's a great experience. But I know that it's not financially possible for so many people, and I feel very privileged to have been able to do it. And also, given things happening at the federal level, I just don't know how secure the future of AmeriCorps is. So I would love to tell anybody, young people, especially young people who are unsure about what career they're interested in, but obviously anyone of any age, because AmeriCorps is for everybody of all ages. But I know it has a lot of draw for young people. I'd love to tell all the young people in my life and listeners that you should do this, but I also know that there's a fair amount of uncertainty, and then financial uncertainty, but then just federal level.
Yeah. And I'll just say to your point, I did my service year in my mid 30s. And it was really a launching pad for the whole industry that I didn't even know existed. And totally understand the caveats of like, who the heck knows what's actually happening over the next 3 to 5 years. But agree, if you can take the jump, take the leap, take the chance, go for it. 100%.
Yeah, and if you can, come serve in Vermont. I'm biased, or just it's worth trying, especially if you're someone who has grown up or primarily spent time in a very urban environment. It could be really valuable to try and get out of your comfort zone geographically, not just from a different area of the country, but if going into a rural setting. Because I think people who have always lived in an urban environment might have preconceptions about what rural life is like, and vice versa, right, too. It goes both ways. Also, just a lot of rural areas really need young people, or not just young people, but people with new ideas and enthusiasm coming into their communities. A lot of the people that I know here who have lived here their whole lives in Bennington, or majority of their lives, can get very cynical about things. And they're like, good old day back in my day,
Yeah.
the factories were open and the jobs were flowing and everything was so much better. And maybe it was better in a number of ways. People who have chosen to come in and make this their adopted community, like me, not just me, but others like me, to see the potential in an area. And I think that's true not just for Bennington, but a lot of other rural or smaller non-urban areas. And there can be a lot of more culture and diversity and going on in rural areas than I think a lot of people might realize. So
I think that is an amazing plane landing where I liked adding young folks into rural areas. That's important. And I think that through this conversation, you really reflected how you came into an experience where you got to learn and grow, and it was challenging, and the pandemic was challenging, but you made your way. And it's a great demonstration of how a service year can guide somebody. And then suddenly you're on this journey with your service year. And at the end, you're like, I did that. It's always so fun to be like, I did that. I did that. As we land this plane and we close out, are there any last thoughts that you have about your service year, or that you want folks to definitely walk away with?
I don't know. I feel like I said what I needed to say in terms of that everybody should do the service year if they're able. And I wish that the situation nationally was such as it was, that people could take that leap, and that they would feel comfortable choosing a service year, both from a financial standpoint, because it would provide them with enough to live comfortably, but also just from a stability standpoint. So I wish that hopefully, if you're still doing this podcast like 5-10 years from now, that we'll be to a point where anybody who wants to participate in a service year through AmeriCorps or any other program, because I know there are so many out there, can do so without having to make difficult financial decisions or wonder if the program's going to go away on the whim of it. So
That is a beautiful end. And if what's Bezos's wife's name? Ellen Mackenzie Scott.
yeah,
If you are listening, literally, like, one of your billions could actually support this AmeriCorps program for quite some time. So Mackenzie Scott, if you're out there. So anyways, Callie, thank you so much for being on the AmeriCorps Connections podcast. And this is the place where we lift up voices of alums that have gone through a service year. They're reflecting on their service year and how it has impacted their lives now. And until next time, thank you. And don't forget to like and subscribe, because it actually really makes a difference. Thank you, Callie. And we'll see you next time.